Welcome to day 3 of my Valentine series. Today we'll be painting a cute golden key. In my previous video, I did a compare and contrast of a student grade palette set versus an artist grade. And I unboxed the Daniel Smith 12 half pan hand poured palette set. While I was able to do swatches in my previous video, this will be the first time I'm using the palette for an actual painting. I'll give my first impressions of the palette and also an easy to follow step-by-step tutorial of the Valentine's key. I already have my simple outline, and for the base layer I'm choosing Hansa Yellow Light. I love the creamy texture of the paint, but the only thing I didn't take into account was how highly pigmented the paint is. So when I was working wet on dry, it was far more concentrated than I'm used to since I was always working with student grade paint. I went in with a dry brush afterwards to try and lift, but because the paint is staining, there really wasn't much lift. I felt like the pencil lines were a little too harsh, so I went in with my kneaded eraser to try and lift some of that off before filling in my key with the rest of the Hansa Yellow Light. This part was really interesting to me because with my student grade paint, I would have had to reload my brush with paint multiple times in order to fill this entire key. But with the artist grade paint, I never had to go back into my palette and I was able to finish the entire key, and I really didn't lose much color. Once I finished with my base layer, I wanted to mix in my midtone, so I added some yellow ochre to the Hansa Yellow Light that I already had in my palette. I'm using this midtone color to just lightly outline the entire key, but I'm also focusing in on the areas that I'm going to add shadow to later. I'm keeping a damp brush handy so that once I put in my darker outline, before it dries, I go in with that damp brush just to soften that line. Because this is the very first start in adding dimension to the key, I feel like this is the ugly phase just because it still looks kind of flat and you're not really seeing any shadows or depth, and when you're adding the color it looks a little cartoonish, very 2D. So you just have to trust the process and keep going. Keep going with your outline, keep going with softening the edges, and try and put in shadows where you think you're going to deepen later on. Once you're done with your midtone area, this is where you would completely dry it before adding on your next dark layer. We'll add some burnt sienna to our yellow ochre mixture, and this will be our next layer in deepening the shadows and creating a little bit more of an outline. Again, we're keeping a damp brush handy so that we are softening all of the hard edges and blending it out. This is where we're starting to see a little bit more depth. So we're adding a little bit of a darker shadow on the left side of the inside of the heart. That way we can see where the light source is coming from. Adding some darker lines coming from the base of the heart moving upwards is a great way to help with adding dimension. It creates a shadow where later we will add the highlight. Moving downwards, the rings on the actual key should look like they are popping out, and there'll be a darker portion in between each ring. So we're going to be adding a lot of shadow in between the rings and then a little bit of darkness on both sides to make it look more rounded. The darkest shadow should be at the very bottom of the rings. That way it helps to lead downwards and again creates more dimension. The most important part here is once you lay down your color, make sure to have your damp brush at the ready and blend those out so there's no harsh lines. Once I'm done with all of the outline and the rest of the shading, I like to go back in and see the places that have already started to dry and see if I can just darken up the shadows a tad more using that same color that's on my brush. Moving on to the next layer, we're going to be adding more of the burnt sienna, but we'll also add a touch of the raw umber. I'm still new to this palette, so I felt like the raw umber was a little too dark for this layer, so I went in with some more burnt sienna. For this layer, we're really going to focus in on the areas with the biggest shadow. So coming from the bottom of the ring, moving downwards, and also the inside of the heart and the shadows at the bottom with the actual key insert portion. And don't forget to use your damp brush to blend everything out. You'll start to see that the dimension will really be more prominent using this layering technique. Once you're done with that layer, we can go back in with our darker color, mix it with what we've been using, and then keep on deepening the shadows. Once we're done with that layer, it's important to completely dry the painting before we go in with our darkest shade. We're going to add some more raw umber to our darkest color and then go into the areas where it's going to have the deepest shadow. Once we're done with this layer, it needs to be completely dried before we add a pop of color to the middle of the heart. So in order for the little red heart to not look flat, we're going to first draw it out with a sap green with a touch of Hansa yellow light, and this will be our complementary color in order to create shading before we turn in the red. So we're just going to outline this heart and blend it out with a damp brush, and so that will be our complementary color underneath our red. It's important to completely dry this before adding the red, otherwise the color will look muddy. I'm adding a little bit of the Pyrrole Scarlet to the green mixture so it will darken it a tad, and then I'm using that to outline the heart first and then blend out towards the middle. Now it's time to do the cast shadow. I'm adding cerulean blue to my darkest shade and I'm diluting it so that I can create the first layer to my cast shadow. I like for my cast shadow to be pretty defined, but I don't want it having a hard line. So I do outline it, but then I'll go in with a damp brush and blend it out so that it's not so harsh. With this being the first layer of the cast shadow, the color is heavily diluted and it's pretty forgiving when it comes to the outline. I can keep layering the cast shadow closest to the key, and that will just darken a little bit more gradually than when I go in with the next darker color for my cast shadow. I added a touch more of my darker shadow shade to the cerulean blue mix, and then I'm just deepening that shadow closest to the key, making sure to blend it out. And I'll do one more layer after I dry it completely. I'm almost at the finish line, so I completely dry it before adding the highlight. I'm using my bleed proof white and a very small brush to add a little bit of highlight in the areas where I think it will be catching the light. Even though I want the highlight to be quite prominent, I'm still blending it out around the edges so that it's not so harsh. I'm making sure to add a little bit of highlight into my red heart, and I'm also going down the key and really accenting the center of the key to try and add dimension. These little highlights really help to add true dimension to your key, and it gives it more of a metallic look. Once you're done blending them out, you're completely done. And this is how it looks in natural light. I hope you liked painting with me on day 3 of this Valentine series. And if you like this video, please subscribe and like, it really helps me out. And hope to see you on the next video.